Welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs Daily War Room Update. We are here today on day 44 of the war of Israel against the Gazan terrorists. We're talking predominantly about Hamas, the events that started on the 7th of October with the massacre of 1,200 Israelis and the capture, taking hostages of another 240 odd, with the injuring of thousands more. And at the same time, Hamas and the other terrorists firing rockets into Israel, indiscriminately targeting our civilian population. We're talking about not only Hamas, but also Palestinian Islamic Jihad, also Fatah, the Al-Aqsa Brigades, the so-called moderate Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. His terror organization was also involved, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, of course, a communist organization that is rejectionist of all of the Oslo Accords, and to this day seeks the destruction of Israel. They are still a member of the PLO, which is also headed by Mahmoud Abbas. That's what we're talking about in the south. We are joined today by really a tremendous advocate for Israel, by Lieutenant Colonel in the reserves, Sarit Zehavi. Sarita is the founder and president of the Alma Center, which we'll discuss a little bit later about. But first, as we do, just give the update on the different arenas. In the south, Israel is continuing to fight on with the Gazan terrorists, going further and further, closing in on the northern part of the Gaza Strip to eliminate as many terrorists there as possible, going in the last few days, not only into the Shifa hospital, but also into that entire complex, but also into the outlying areas, to ensure that we gather both as much information as possible, as much intelligence as possible, and also eliminate many of the terrorists as possible. We're extending and broadening the assault at the moment, also now to the southern areas, to Khan Yunis, to Rafiah. If in the first 3.5 weeks of the fighting on the ground in Gaza, we've been focusing mainly on the northern area, we're now getting to the point where we will have to start moving also down south. That will be also particularly complicated because of all the civilians that have moved down there. But nonetheless, we understand that most of the terrorists, most of the senior heads of Hamas have now moved down via the tunnel system. Hamas have dug 500 kilometers of tunnels under Gaza, so they've now moved down towards the south. The understanding is that we've done enough in the first part of the fighting to ensure that those terrorists will not be able to move back up to the north as we move south. We ask, I can see that some people are already raising their questions. We ask that if there are any questions, they be put into the chat. We don't open the microphone for general questions, so please put your questions into the chat and we will try and address them there. That's on the southern area. We've now taken, as of this morning, 60 Israeli soldiers killed in the Gaza Strip since the beginning of the fighting on the ground. We're talking about an unknown number of terrorists killed in the Gaza Strip. The numbers of deaths that you're seeing and hearing coming out of the Gaza Strip are all put out by the Hamas Ministry of Health in the Gaza Strip. Hamas controls and dominates that organization. It is a branch of Hamas. It is part of their propaganda machine. And so no numbers that come from them should be given any credibility or any reliability. Many of the people have been killed. Israel already says that on the first day of fighting, there were some 1,500 terrorists killed. And since then, in the ground operations, the last figure I saw, that there have been another 3,000 to 3,500 terrorists killed on the ground. So we're talking already somewhere in the region of 5,000 terrorists at least that have been killed since the beginning of the fighting. Whilst there are advanced negotiations going on to introduce and allow humanitarian aid to go into the Gaza Strip, we're still seeing those constant claims of the electricity is about to run out, the fuel's about to run out, the food's about to run out. What clearly isn't running out in Gaza is the rockets and the mortar shells that they carry on firing. Even as we were talking, introducing the program, there were more mortar attacks going on Israel's southern border. On the northern arena, which we will discuss in more depth with Sarit, we've seen Hezbollah continuing on with this constant war of attrition, constantly attacking Israeli soldiers and Israeli civilians as well. The death toll there on both sides growing. In Israel, we're talking about, I think at the last count, 11 deaths already. And on the Hezbollah side, over 60 terrorists have already been targeted. But we'll leave that now for a little bit of an in-depth analysis from Sarit. On the wider picture, just as we were going into the broadcast, we were hearing some reports of the Houthis seizing some type of ship of partial Israeli ownership. We're not exactly clear of the details there, but the Houthis that have already fired a number of missiles in Israel's direction, all under the guidance, of course, of Iran. Iran operating its proxies, whether it be Hamas, Hezbollah, or the Houthis, all trying to endanger Israel from every level possible. What we're seeing at the moment also is the continuing fight against the terrorist organizations in Judea and Samaria. That terrible attack on Thursday, where we also suffered another loss. We understand Hamas is trying its best to carry out as many attacks as possible. It's something which is really just a matter of time until they succeed, more and more in their eyes succeed. What we saw today as a truly indicative measure and move on the side of the Palestinian Authority was a message put out by the Palestinian Authority Ministry of Foreign Affairs accusing Israel and Israeli helicopters of being responsible for many of the deaths at the Nova nature party. This is, of course, a completely unjustified libel against Israel. We saw the Hamas terrorists with their GoPro cameras filming and proud of their own actions. And so now to try and put that blame onto Israel based on some type of a report is really quite indicative of what they do. On the one hand, celebrating the death of the Israelis and calling the attacks heroic. On the other side, now suddenly blaming Israel when it appears to be less beneficial for them. The other worrying but also indicative development is a survey carried out in the Birzeit University in Ramallah in the West Bank. There we saw some 80% support amongst the students for the October 7 massacre. Really, this is showing that whilst the terrorists are, of course, responsible for their actions, they are not acting in a vacuum, as Antonio Guterres so disgustingly put it. They are acting in the context of 30 years of brainwashing by the Palestinian Authority, of being taught that it's good to hate, kill, and be killed, that Israel must be destroyed with all means possible. And that's not even Hamas. That's just the teachings of the so-called moderate Palestinian Authority that President Biden would like to see play a central part in the rehabilitation of the Gaza Strip, and that we at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs believe is a complete non-starter. So that's really the overview. We're seeing a continued quiet amongst the Israeli Arab population. The Friday prayers on the Temple Mount passing by without incident. Again, there were some fears initially that we would see a repeat of the 2021 events, but that is something which really hasn't been seen. And we're seeing as much as the Palestinians support the massacre of the Israelis on October 7th, so the Israeli Arab population is more supportive of Israel and its right to self-defense, I think, than ever before. This is probably one of the most positive developments that we've seen, with both journalists, publicists, everyone expressing that same opinion. Now I'd like to move on to Sarit. As I said before, Sarit founded and is now the director of Alma. Sarit, if you could give us just a little bit of an insight as to what Alma does, for those of you that haven't been there, including, of course, the website and everything else. For those of you that haven't heard of Alma and the center, Sarit has a an amazing center in the north, a tremendously deep understanding of Hezbollah and everything of Hezbollah's ideology, tremendously unique outposts and lookouts on the northern border where you can see and hear the analysis as you're looking on really to what's being explained. I had really the honor of being a participant in one of Sarit's amazing trips to the north just over a year ago, and I really would recommend it for whoever can. Go onto the website, check out Sarit's and Alma's updates. It's really something very eye-opening. So Sarit, give us a little bit of an update as to what's happening on that northern border, what's driving Hezbollah at the moment, and where we stand.
Alma's mission is to provide platform of knowledge in English about Israel's security challenges on the northern border. So you can assume that what is happening now is kind of our money time, because this is practically war. You defined it very accurately, war of attrition. And I think that, what frustrates me the most is that people are talking about Gaza, but hardly understanding what is happening here, and hardly gives weight to what is happening here. But actually, there is a clear connection between the south and the north. The northern border of Israel is active since October 8th. Every day since October 8th, we have attacks, either mortars, missiles, UAVs, anti-tanks, infiltrations, every day since October 8th, while we see a gradual increase in the amount of attacks every day, a little bit more, or every week, a little bit more. Yesterday and today were a very good example for this increase. We had today an attack of UAVs that were probably intercepted. We don't have a clear understanding exactly. We had mortars that were launched today, almost every day throughout the Galilee, western sector, eastern sector, whatever. What you see behind me, and you mentioned the tours along the northern border, what you see behind me in the pictures, these are pictures that were taken on Israel's northern border, on the Israeli-Lebanese border, in the past year or two of Hezbollah. You can see the positions of Hezbollah behind me, and you can see Hezbollah military operatives, actually terrorists, watching me, taking photos of me with binoculars. Each time I went to the border, I saw them. So actually, Alma Center had kind of, a privilege, I don't know if it's the right word, to not only to write and to read and to research on Hezbollah and Lebanon and Syria and the Iranian involvement, but actually to see it in our own eyes every day when we went to the border. And every day when we went to the border in the past few years, we have seen the preparations for an invasion of Hezbollah, the same invasion that Hamas executed in Gaza was actually planned and prepared over here. And it's funny, I had a conversation last week with one of the security officers of one of the communities next to the border, which I used to take the groups to stand there and to see Hezbollah from inside the community. And he answers the phone and he says, Sarit, look, we were so lucky. Now, what kind of Israeli is saying we were so lucky these days? The only one who understands that it was supposed to be our fate to be massacred. And at some point of time, plans were changed and the mission was given to Hamas rather than to Hezbollah. But both of them had exactly the same plan and both of them were prepared. And we, since we are focusing on the north, we saw the preparations, and in the past year we wrote about it many, many times, that Hezbollah is prepared for war, that Hezbollah is interested in escalation. There were terrorist attacks on the border in the past year coming from Hezbollah or proxies, which we understood it's actually Hezbollah behind it. And we understood that the border had changed and nobody is changing the analysis of who is behind that and what's the intentions. Alma's center mission is to create awareness, and I'm not hiding our agenda, to create awareness to what might happen, since the firepower of Hezbollah is 20 times more than the firepower of Hamas. It's about 200,000 different kind of missiles to various ranges and UAVs, etc. And some of them are even accurate missiles. While what Hezbollah is doing now is creating a new reality on the northern border, that it is clear that it is an unbearable reality, meaning 60,000 Israelis were evacuated from the borderline in communities which are 0 to 5 kilometers from the border. And there is no prospect now of when and how they are going to go back to their homes, since Hezbollah is using these accurate anti-tank missiles every day to launch against these communities. Sometimes it's a military target inside the community, and sometimes it's even a civilian target. This is a situation that we can't accept.
That's, I think, one of the things that is least understood, really, as you quite clearly put it, Sarit. It's understanding who Hezbollah is, as opposed to Hamas. While Hamas are a genocidal, homicidal terrorists and managed to storm Israel quite successfully from their point of view on the 7th of October. This is something which we saw coming from Hezbollah already a few years ago. One of the points along the trip on the northern border is going through and entering into the Hezbollah tunnels. Hezbollah, if our audience will remember, had spent many years digging tunnels across the border into Israel that were then discovered at the beginning of 2018, or exposed at the beginning of 2018. And there we only then did we understand that they had a number of tunnels located along the entire length of our northern border that really did come deep into Israel, and in the same way as Hamas has its Nukhba forces, so Hezbollah has the Radwan forces, and their goal was to actually infiltrate Israel via the tunnels and to carry out their same massacre. And now we're seeing this development of Hezbollah. Hezbollah, just a background. With Hezbollah, we've had the war before in 2006, and we destroyed an extensive part of their capabilities. In the last 17, 18 years, they have completely not only rearmed themselves, but strengthened themselves. And what Sarit mentioned as something which we understand to be something which is it's just a reality. I think it's worthwhile stressing, Sarit. So I'm just going to go back to that point. Sarit said, and I almost quote, as opposed to Hamas, this isn't a quote yet, who have been firing some 10,000 rockets into Israel, which they fire their rockets a general direction and they hope to hit a target. Hezbollah has some 200,000 rockets that of different strengths, capable of reaching different distances, some of which are precision weapons, right? So that means that they can choose any target almost in Israel, put in a coordinate, and that target will be attacked. Give us a little bit of an insight.
Let's put down the numbers. Comparing the amount of shells, about 145 out of the 200,000 are mortars, which are for short range. If they are positioned on the border, short range would mean 20 kilometers upper Galilee. About 5,000 more are to longer ranges around Jerusalem, a few tens of kilometers, I'll put it this way, and 5,000 more are longer ranges, Jerusalem and above. That's, the evaluations, okay, maybe here and there, but the evaluations about the amounts of rockets. With regard to the precision-guided missiles, these are only a few hundreds by the evaluations of the IDF, but you should add around 2,000 UAVs and drones, that these are very accurate. They can carry different kind of explosives, and we've seen the damage these have done in Gaza on our positions, surveillance positions. And you should add the anti-tanks missiles, which I don't know how many they have, but they already launched quite a few that the range is only a few kilometers, but the damage is huge because they are very, very accurate. Nasrallah himself, by the way, in an interview a few years ago, presented a map of the state of Israel and elaborate all the civilian, mainly civilian, a little bit of military infrastructure in Israel, whether it's the malls, medical centers, the Knesset, the desalination plants, electricity, gas, whatever. And in the end, the interview, like, you know, after 10, 15 minutes that he elaborates everything that he sees on this map, he says, I have the capability to get to all these places. And actually, he meant these PGMs, these accurate missiles. So that's one, I think, when we analyze the capabilities of Hezbollah and the risks coming from Hezbollah, one thing is the aerial threat, which we just discussed, and the other one is Radwan brigades, which you mentioned, the tunnels. The idea of the tunnels was not to send an infiltration of a squad. The idea of the tunnels was to send thousands of military combatants, by the way, very well experienced from the war in Syria, to take over the Galilee. Now, I must tell you, even I was mistaken, because when I presented that to the people who came here, I said, they're saying it's taking over the Galilee. I can't believe they will be able to take over the Galilee. But after I saw what happened in Gaza, and actually how difficult it is to prevent an invasion if you don't have preliminary intelligence, while the physical barrier is not enough. And in the north, the physical barrier is much less impressive than the one in the south, okay? We don't have a wall, even though you see a wall behind me over there, we don't have a wall everywhere on the northern border. Maybe half of the border, maybe less, is wall. In other places, it's just a fence. And since this war started, what Hezbollah was doing is to target our civilians, whether it's antennas and cameras, etc. So for me, it is very clear that Hezbollah is preparing for another invasion. Now, it's right that the IDF now is much more prepared, and it is deployed on the border. I feel much safer than I used to feel in the first week of the war when there was nobody here. But I'm kind of worried from both scenarios, you know, from the scenario of war and of the scenario of going back to routine while this threat is not being dealt, and then what?
So how exactly what would that look like? Let's say that we come to the end of the war in Gaza and Hezbollah hasn't opened a much wider attack. When would people go back? How would they be exposed to that danger? What are we talking about when we're talking about Hezbollah? Are we talking about an organization that is deterred? Are they in any way responsible for what happens in Lebanon? Just last year, for example, Israel announced that it had come to a great agreement almost with Hezbollah, with the negotiations of the American team to allow the Lebanese government to develop a gas field in the Mediterranean Sea that had been the subject of much conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. Israel eventually just gave up on all of its arguments and allowed Hezbollah to develop the field. And the argument at the time was that this was now the start of peace with Hezbollah, that they were deterred. How does that play into this whole scenario that we're seeing now? Are they deterred? Do they have the best interests of Lebanon at heart? How's that playing out?
So actually, there are two questions here. One is the general question about deterrence, and the other one is about the gas deal. I will address the first and then the second. As for the deterrence, I strongly recommend us now, after what happened in the area of Gaza, to erase this word, not use it anymore, forget about it, and try a new analysis, because it just doesn't work, and it's just not the way the other side thinks, because the other side do not cherish life the way we do. And that's why I think that we shouldn't look at deterrence. We should look at interests. We should look at the wider picture. it's not only Hamas, it's not only Hezbollah, there is Iran behind it. And the plan that we talked about, the operational plan of offensive plan against the state of Israel, was not written in Gaza, and I'm not sure it was written in Beirut. Maybe it was written in Tehran. The fact that we see attacks from Yemen as well, the fact that we see attacks against American forces in Iraq and Syria are kind of a proof to what I'm saying. And yet people ask the question, what Hezbollah wants, since it didn't start an all-out war the way everybody expected, including myself, by the way. When we saw what is happening with Hamas, the first thing I had done, living 9 kilometers from the Lebanese border, was to prepare my shelter at home, because I didn't know where this is heading. But I think that now, after more than 40 days, we can say clearly that we understand better, and maybe we shouldn't think in Western terms. And Western terms want everything quickly. And in Yom Kippur War, the experience was that we were attacked from two fronts. But actually, if you study the Yom Kippur War from military level, you understand, if the Iranians studied the Yom Kippur War from military aspect, you understand that Israel not only survived, that it was a military victory, even though with all the pain that we suffered in this war, it was a military victory comparing to the fact that we were surprised. So why repeat it? I think that the strategy of Iran is exactly the attrition war, is to create, or if you like, to sacrifice Palestinians, by the way, Sunnis, Hamas, maybe West Bank as well, I don't know, and Hezbollah. Well, if it will deteriorate into war, fine. And if it's not, also fine. But they are prepared for this scenario. They are prepared for this option long ago. As for Hezbollah itself, I believe that Hezbollah is interested to take over Lebanon. That's the main interest, okay, here with Hezbollah. And there is kind of a dialogue between the Iranian interest and the Hezbollah interest, okay? The interest is not to make peace with Israel, be deterred. All these terms are, I think we should create a different framework for the discussion. And the discussion is, if you want to take over Lebanon, what's the best way to do it? Okay, and if you are joining Hamas and sacrificing Lebanon on the cause of the Palestinian issue, how is that serves the cause or the interest of taking over Lebanon? And I'm not sure it does. So now, if I'm connecting to the Gaza deal, what actually Nasrallah had done? He looked for an excuse that will serve the Lebanese cause, which was the Gaza, a lot of money. Of course, it's a Lebanese cause. It's a good cause in the eyes of the Lebanese to go to war. So he was serious. He was prepared to war. And what the Israeli government had done was to postpone the war. There was no peace treaty. Hezbollah didn't, for a moment, didn't make any obligation to cease fire, to disarm, to I don't know what. Anybody who thought this is the opening door for normalization was just living in illusions. The only thing that we got out of this gas deal is gas. Okay, it enabled us to get the gas of Karish, and it enabled us to postpone the war for an unknown date, which is still an unknown date. But again, since the situation on the northern border now is that different than what it used to be a year and a half ago, it may happen tomorrow. Like, how are we going to bring back the people who are living here? How am I going to live in safety, living 9 kilometers from the border?
What you seem to be suggesting, though, Sarit, is that Hezbollah does have that interest, that first interest of taking over Lebanon, and therefore anything else which would possibly detract from that goal would be something which they wouldn't consider desirable. So attacking Israel obviously would take them away from that goal of taking over Lebanon, and they obviously understand that it would bring in.
Why are you saying that? After the previous war, Hezbollah suffered a lot of damages. The support among Lebanese was damaged after 2006. But if you look 17 years backwards, you see something different. Okay? You see that Hezbollah became stronger. It became a prominent political player in Lebanon, member of the government itself. The discussion is not anymore around disarming Hezbollah like it was before the war of 2006. Okay, there is no discussion like that in Lebanon anymore. The military capabilities of Hezbollah maybe tripled, maybe 4 times more. So I think in the eyes of Hezbollah, maybe it's okay to sacrifice some sacrifices for a short term, but in the long term, it will weaken all the other players, which are already very much shaken thanks to the economic and political crisis in Lebanon. That's why I'm saying, if you look at long terms rather than short terms, the whole perspective changes. And then you see the interests of the different players in a completely different way.
So the threat you're saying from Hezbollah, even at the moment, is something which is very real, and they are turning to war because they see that not only as something which is good for them promoting their own goals of destroying Israel, but also good for them internally, politically, for their own goals within Lebanon. So
I can't say if it's tomorrow, next week, or next year. What I can say is that they are prepared, that they prefer to drag Israel into war rather than initiate it completely like Hamas had done. Again, for the Hamas, for the Palestinian cause, they would initiate it for the Gaza or any other Lebanese clear interest. And that's why, for now, you see a gradual escalation, but that put Israel in a situation that I don't know how this is going to be solved.
So you mentioned that Hezbollah after the last war became stronger and really much more emboldened. At the same time, we were seeing not a small amount of international politics, and we can possibly call it, with Resolution 1701, the famous resolution of the UN Security Council calling for the redeployment of Hezbollah north of the Litani River, and the disarming of Hezbollah. Now you say that whilst that resolution is still in force, there are still UN forces on the border, ostensibly with Israel, enforcing that decision. What you're saying to us really is that it's completely destroyed. It doesn't exist anymore.
This resolution was never enforced by any player in Lebanon. While when we speak about UNIFIL, they never thought it's their mission to enforce the resolution. They deny that this is their mission. They are saying, UNIFIL is saying very clearly that the mission of the UN forces in Lebanon is to support Lebanese army, and while the Lebanese army collaborates with Hezbollah. So I don't see where this is heading exactly. 1701 is dead completely, and actually it was never alive, and it was never effective. Maybe there was a little bit, very little effectiveness when we speak about preventing war that nobody exactly wanted. But even with this today, it's completely irrelevant. Again, Hezbollah is doing whatever it wants in South Lebanon these days. And UNIFIL is just, my suggestion to UNIFIL, leave as quickly as possible, because Hezbollah is using you as human shields.
And that has direct implications also for what we're discussing for the situation on the ground in Gaza post the end of the war. And one of the suggestions that have been made is that there'll be some type of international peacekeeping force. Now, we've experienced these forces before in the past. There was one such force in the Sinai Peninsula between 1956 and 1967, when Nasser decided it was time to again attack Israel, so he just sent them out. But in the north, we're seeing that the UN force is operating in parallel to Hezbollah, never really seeing it as their job to enforce any type of decision. And so what are they actually doing there?
Look, what happened with UNIFIL is that we compromised, okay? Let's tell the truth. We compromised upon the phrasing of 1701 of the resolution in the United Nations. We were under a lot of pressure with the international community to end the hostilities. And this resolution was softened and softened and softened until the phrasing that was put down became irrelevant and created 10,000 soldiers force that has no teeth to bite and no teeth to enforce the resolution itself. So if we are talking on any future arrangement that will involve that will involve international forces, rather in Gaza or in Lebanon, it should be phrased in a very clear, undoubted words that give the authority and the responsibility to this international force to make sure that the area is not used for terror without any unclearness in the way it is put, which this was happened with 1701. Israel shouldn't agree to any less than that. Doesn't matter whether it's Gaza or Lebanon. And another thing, the force that will be created, wherever it is, must be willing to use its weapons to implement its mission, which this is not the case with UNIFIL. UNIFIL is armed. It has the authority to use its weapons against anybody who is trying to damage its mission or to block its way, and it is not using its weapons. So I am not against international supervision or monitoring or whatever you name it. I'm not against that, but this force must be willing to die for us, because Hezbollah is not going to just disarm all of a sudden from its free will for the security of the state of Israel or for the security of the state of Lebanon, by the way. It's not going to happen. Any international force that will be positioned in Lebanon without Israel taking care of Hezbollah will have violent conflicts with Hezbollah.
So let's take that point a little bit further, Sarit, and also address one of our and the questions that we've had from our audience from Reuven Hoch. And since a war with Lebanon and with Hezbollah seems almost inevitable, would you say that it's in Israel's interest to wait until that war starts at Hezbollah's initiative and at the timing which is convenient for Hezbollah? Or would you say there's more of an interest to carry out a preemptive strike against Hezbollah and already to neutralize for our audience and for those following us, have to take into account that almost on a daily basis for the last 4 or 5 years, there have been a number of attacks by Israel carried out in Syria, intercepting weapons being sent by Iran through Syria into Lebanon. Some with the tacit agreement of the Russians, some with the express agreement of the Russians, those famous relations between Vladimir Putin and Prime Minister Netanyahu that allowed and facilitated that war between the wars, as it was called in Hebrew, and by the Israeli security forces. But nonetheless, as Sarit said, they've managed to amass hundreds, if not more, of precision weapons and tens of thousands of rockets, and all of that is facing is attacking Israel. They don't have any other. Lebanon doesn't have any other enemies, to the best of my understanding, and so should we wait for them to attack, or would it be in Israel's interest to identify where those weapons are being held? For those who remember, also probably about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, the IDF and the Prime Minister released a series of pictures of the positioning of Hezbollah weapons within the civilian and urban neighborhoods in and around Beirut, specifically next to the airport. So we almost do know where those weapons are. I assume we still have those intelligence capabilities. If you were the one now sitting on the ear of Prime Minister Netanyahu, what would you recommend, Sarit?
First, just the pros and cons. There is a contradiction between military level and the, if I may say, political level. The military level, of course, if we take off the threat and we initiate it, first we prevent an invasion that even now with all the forces here, if Hezbollah will initiate an invasion, it means that there will be fightings on the Israeli side of the border. This is what it means. Even though the IDF is prepared and the civilians are not here, people will get killed on the Israeli side of the border. Well, if we initiate an attack against Hezbollah, well, as you said, we know where the rockets are. By the way, even Alma Center published around 30 sites of missiles in Beirut of Hezbollah. This would mean that we can eliminate the threat of at least the rockets. It will take time. Look how long it is taking in Gaza, but I believe that in the military level, we are capable of that. But it's going to be a challenge as well. And it's going to take maybe even longer than Gaza, since the terrain is different, the terrain is bigger, the amounts are bigger, etc. So going for a preemptive attack from the military point of view has a lot of benefits. The question is, are we going to, as I always say, finish the job? Because you've seen that in Gaza, in each operation, eventually we didn't finish the job. We were under a lot of international pressure. Today, international arena don't understand what we are facing here up north, has zero information around that, except for we published in Alma. And I don't see international community gives us a green light to go and do in Lebanon what we just had done in Gaza, which is clear to all of us that this is going to be the damage, because Hezbollah is using the Lebanese as human shields, just exactly as Hamas. The rockets are below the beds of the children. There is no difference in this. So what will happen? We'll go for a preemptive attack, and in the middle of the way, we will be stopped with a poor resolution that we will have to compromise upon in the United Nations that will not enable us to bring security to the north. And that's why, if you ask me, it's not either that or that. It should be a combination, that the leading interest is to mobilize the international community to understand that we are facing a major plan here, that it's not the framework of Israel-Hamas war. It's something much greater than that. And once we do that, maybe we will have a little bit more legitimacy, which as Israelis, of course, we have legitimacy. But again, with regard to the munitions that we get from the United States, the friendship, Netanyahu talked about it yesterday with a lot of details. This is important. We cannot ignore completely the international arena here, especially not with Lebanon, which is, receiving a kind of a unique relation from the international community. It's even different than Gaza and different than Hamas. And that's why it's so important to create an open dialogue. And maybe you mentioned that Netanyahu exposed the sites of Hezbollah in Beirut. We should expose more. We should give more information around that. We should give more information about how Hezbollah is using the Lebanese as human shields, and create the platform for future decisions, military decisions to be made. We do have time, because we are now busy in Gaza, okay? There are priorities and it's okay. We do have time to try to find the answers, which I don't have all the answers and all the solutions, but we do have time. I don't want to have a campaign in Lebanon that will be stopped in the middle and will end in a resolution in the United Nations that eventually will bring us back to the same situation as we were in October 6th.
I think that's inevitable. No matter what the war is, Israel has no desire really to go into Lebanon and to completely uproot and destroy entirely Hezbollah. That's I don't think has ever been one of the Israel's goals. And so I think that we are just destined to stay with that danger on our northern base, on our northern border, almost forever. If you say that.
No, this is impossible. Here I must talk as a resident of the Galilee who lives 9 kilometers from the border. This is unacceptable, and this is what everybody needs to understand outside of Israel. This is unacceptable to continue to live with the monster on the other side of the border. Nobody would accept that in anywhere in the world. This is unacceptable. I don't sleep at night because I'm afraid for my little girl. What if Hezbollah will cross the fence and come after me? Since October 7th, this is my life here. I live in a nightmare practically because I've seen what is happening in the south. And once the reservists will go home and the US carrier will go home, who is going to protect us? We cannot end this campaign with just a ceasefire that will leave Hezbollah that way in these pictures behind me on the border. This is not going to happen this time.
And what about the Lebanese army, Sarit? I understand that with Hezbollah, we are almost at a dead end. Is there any hope with the Lebanese army? The Lebanese army has received international support, international funding, tremendous even support from the US Biden administration. Also, that whole push with the gas deal under the Biden. It seems to be that the Biden administration on all the different fronts is living in that whole almost twilight zone of you can placate these terrorists and you can support them and thereby control them. Is that an option? Is the Lebanese army at any way an active player, a relevant actor?
The Lebanese army is an active player. If there will be war between Israel and Hezbollah, the Lebanese army, which is deployed in South Lebanon, will participate as an enemy of the state of Israel. It has to. I completely understand that, because there will be a competition between the Lebanese army and Hezbollah, who is the protector of Lebanon. Other than that, even now, before the war, we saw collaboration on the border between Hezbollah and the Lebanese army. We saw Hezbollah using Lebanese army positions. I myself saw Hezbollah taking photos of me accompanied by Lebanese army soldier. Lebanese army is already, with the majority of combat soldiers coming from the Shiite sect. The salaries of Lebanese army's senior officers are the same as the salaries of the most simple terrorist, low-rank terrorists in Hezbollah. So I understand what the Americans are trying to do. I truly understand, because I understand that if the Americans will not give any assistance whatsoever to the Lebanese army, somebody else will. And then, okay, it will be Iran, it will be China, it will be Russia. We don't want that either. But on the other hand, the assumption should be made that any munitions that is given to the Lebanese army either will end up in the hands of Hezbollah or will be fired at Israel by the Lebanese army. So in this respect, I truly don't understand, for example, why anybody should provide anti-tank missiles to the Lebanese army. And it happened not long ago by France. What tanks? Whose tanks? These are Israeli tanks. That's it. That's the only threat. Syria is threatening Lebanon with its tanks. So, okay, if you want to help the Lebanese army, I think it's important to try to understand what do we get out of that, what kind of leverage we can use after giving assistance to the Lebanese army. And we must make sure that this assistance is not endangering IDF soldiers.
I think your description of the reality on our northern border, Sarit, is something which is truly disastrous, even for our national security, for understanding the situation, having tens of thousands of our civilians evacuated from that line. And as you say, this constant fear of possibly never being able to go back, even without Hezbollah even invading. So we're having, instead of the terrorists being deterred by Israel, Israel is deterred by the terrorists without them even launching a full-scale attack, which is something which I think has to be explained more to both to the international community and to decision makers. I think it's something which you did with tremendous skill, Sarit. Thank you very much for that really introduction to what's going on the Lebanese border. I think that what you said before about maybe recommending to the Israeli government and Alma itself publishing more updated and really information about where Hezbollah is holding its missile arsenal is something which the world needs to know. The world needs to take into account when you're talking about supporting Hezbollah. So every single foreign minister should know that Hezbollah is holding rockets underneath the beds of children in Beirut, in all of the civilian infrastructure, in something which, as both as Prime Minister Netanyahu has said and Defense Minister Gallant has said, and this shouldn't be taken lightly. I don't think that if there were to be a situation where Israel was required to open another front on the northern border, then Lebanon would find itself going back to the Stone Age. If that's something which the international community truly desires to avoid, then now is the money time for them to say and to use all of the leverage possible against Hezbollah, to contain Hezbollah, and to actually enforce, yes, that using that dirty word, actually enforce Resolution 1701, and to ensure that the Hezbollah forces are disarmed and moved to further north within Lebanon. From a personal note, I know that I have a very close relative who served until recently in an IDF unit and was on the northern border, and she came home and told, it's my daughter, who came home and told me that she was seeing those same scenes that you described of Hezbollah terrorists on the border, taking pictures of them during their activities. It's something which really is quite frightening, and it's something which needs to be a cause for concern, really, not only for Israel's security, but for the entire region. Sarit, thank you very, very much indeed. We'll be happy, obviously, to spread around more and more information from Alma. As I said before, you didn't give Sarit Alma's website. If you could just help people get in so they know where to go, maybe an email to contact you, that I think would be also helpful.
Yeah, I'm putting that on the chat. This is Israel-Alma.org. You're invited to take a look at the research page. There is tons of information there. We published a lot of reports in the past 2 years about Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, the Iranian involvement in the region, with a lot of visuals that can exemplify everything we just discussed.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Sarit. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will be back with you again tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock Israel time. In the meantime, stay safe. Have a good evening, good afternoon, good day.